When a patient presents with psychosis or severe anxiety, the outward symptoms can look identical, even if the biological or environmental mechanisms are entirely different. Historically, categorizing psychiatric conditions based on overlapping phenotypes created diagnostic ambiguity and left healthcare tracking imprecise. The World Health Organization designed the 11th revision of the International Classification of Diseases as a rigid structural overhaul of psychiatric taxonomy. Chapter 06, covering mental, behavioral, or neurodevelopmental disorders, separates the outward manifestation of a disease from its clinical etiology. Modern clinical data architecture cannot rely on flat lists. It requires an etiological matrix to definitively track where a disorder originates. The underlying structural logic of Chapter 06 forces all psychiatric presentations into distinct etiological vectors. This visual matrix systematically triages raw, overlapping patient data into three main taxonomical columns: primary, substance, and secondary. The first column captures endogenous disorders, those originating intrinsically within the brain's architecture. The second column handles exogenous conditions, which are driven exclusively by external chemical agents or behavioral addictions. The third column isolates systemic conditions, where the psychiatric presentation is a downstream byproduct of a separate physiological disease. By organizing clinical data through these three pillars, the ICD-11 requires a diagnosis to function as a declaration of the disease's root cause. To see how this works in the actual ICD-11 database, we start with the baseline vector, conditions where the psychopathology itself is the primary disease process. This interface displays the strict cascading node tree framework navigated by medical coders and clinicians. Opening block L16A2, dedicated to schizophrenia or other primary psychotic disorders, shows this taxonomy in action. Here we find specific diagnostic codes representing the highest level of endogenous psychiatric illness, like 6A20 for schizophrenia and 6A21 for schizoaffective disorder. The deliberate use of the word primary in the block title means these codes are strictly reserved for presentations that have no distinct external trigger. Applying a code from block L16A2 legally and clinically confirms the exclusion of chemical or systemic causes, locking the diagnosis into an intrinsic etiology. The second etiological vector captures conditions forced upon the brain by external factors. Navigating away from primary psychoses, we open block L16C4 for exogenous conditions. Alongside traditional chemical dependencies like alcohol, code 6C40, and cannabis, 6C41, the taxonomy now features a separated entry for synthetic cannabinoids under 6C42. Distinguishing synthetic agents from standard cannabis ensures precision in epidemiological data tracking and dictates highly specific treatment protocols for clinicians. This block also reflects a major architectural update in ICD-11, the inclusion of non-chemical behavioral triggers. Subtier block L26C5 introduces behavioral addictions, specifically 6C50 for gambling disorder and 6C51 for gaming disorder. Grouping chemical ingestions and digital gaming under the exact same parent block proves the system prioritizes the mechanism of addiction over the physical nature of the trigger. The final etiological vector deals with psychiatric symptoms presenting as primary disorders, but actually caused by a systemic physiological disease, like a brain tumor. To catch these systemic byproducts, the database uses block L16E6. This block maps a direct relationship between a physiological source disease and a resulting symptom, like 6E61 for secondary psychotic syndrome. The framework also accounts for other manifestations, including 6E62, secondary mood syndrome. If a patient presents with psychosis caused by an endocrine issue, coding it as primary schizophrenia is a data failure. It must be coded as secondary. The exact same phenotypic presentation of psychosis is routed to entirely divergent taxons purely on its origin, enforcing clinical accuracy. Establishing etiology is the first step in building a full, multidimensional patient profile. In this visual model, those three etiological columns serve as the baseline x-axis of a much larger data matrix. We then introduce a vertical y-axis for physiological comorbidities. ICD-11 treats somatic states like sleep disruptions as parallel variables. Chapter 07 populates this y-axis with specific physiological data points. Code 7A00 for chronic insomnia intersects with the primary psychiatric code to construct a comprehensive dual diagnosis profile. Mapping these physiological variables on an independent axis prevents crucial somatic data from being buried underneath a dominant psychiatric label. The final dimension of modern psychiatric assessment measures the real-world functional deficit caused by the disease. A new z-axis for functional impairment extrudes outward, transforming the 2D grid into a 3D data cube. Chapter 5 populates this z-axis using the WHODAS 2.0 framework. It evaluates cognitive capacities, applying codes like VA00 for attention and VA02 for solving problems. Determining origin on the x-axis and physiological state on the y-axis is clinically incomplete without this z-axis, quantifying the patient's daily capability limitations. This 3D matrix mandates mapping a disorder's phenotypic presentation alongside its exact origin, somatic footprint, and measurable impact on human life.